So to really be in tune with your employees, to understand that, this is a new workplace. And so some of those old norms, what we call in the book, the zero sum workplace, then it's not relevant. It's relevant today. There's a new generation of talent who are fast becoming the majority talent. They have different expectations, and we know what to do. We know what good management feels like. So really, my big advice is to listen to them, to respect them, to let them know that you've heard through your actions, not performative, through your actions.
Step into the world of success with Your Brand Amplified, the ultimate podcast designed to unravel the intricacies of thriving businesses. I'm your host, Annika Jackson, and I'm on a mission to uncover the stories, strategies, and secrets that have propelled entrepreneurs and business leaders to success. I am so thrilled to have Dr. Angela Jackson here. Love the last name, of course. And you're the founder of Future Forward Strategies. You also are a lecturer at Harvard Graduate School of Education, a woman after my own heart. I am not just a branding, marketing, comms person. I teach grad school at University of Southern California. And I'm very interested in the state of education and the workforce because there's so many layers of intricacy on top of the layers that are already there. When we think about the economy, when we think about the advent of AI technology and all of that. But first, of course, we want to get into, the people aspect and what we really need to know, like the core things that are in every business and always will be, no matter what else is going on. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is something I think about all day, every day. And I love that you are at USC. I feel like, you and I have a real unique vantage point on this because we're experiencing the world of work, but we're also like teaching the next generation about this and learning from them too.
Yeah.
And so those are types of insights that I bring to my work, my research, and conversations.
What was it that got you interested in pursuing this line of work in the first place?
Well, people always ask me that story. It really started, I was working at this job, Nokia, and I was working internationally, building new businesses domestically and internationally. And I was like that movie Up in the Air, and I had, millions of miles, all the things. And I remember I was in LA for business. I lived in New York at the time. I was in LA for business, and I had a meeting at 10, and then I had to make a 1 o'clock flight to go back to New York, and then I was going to be off to Europe. And I remember as I was driving to that 10 a.m. meeting, I was like, gosh, I hope it doesn't run long. I can't miss my flight. I've got to get back to New York so I can, change my suitcase and get on. And in that instance, I wasn't present and got into a car accident, which, was my fault, unfortunately. But because of that, I was like laid on the couch for 6 months. And thinking about like, one, my life could have ended, but two, I thought about this whole idea of work. And part of work was, and I've learned this later when I started researching it, we spend a third of our life at work. And when I think about myself after the accident, I was sitting down, I was single, I was living in New York, I hadn't seen my family. And I thought, gosh, I've been spending all my life on work and investing here. What do I have to show for it? And it made me think that there's another way to do work. And what I decided to go back and do my doctoral work in research organizations to find out, like, how were people balancing this work-life integration? What were the practices that employers and strategies they were leveraging that helped for thriving, but also like helped individuals like grow and be more productive, but also help their business as well?
Yeah. Those are all questions that I think we all probably think about every day if we're educators. Like you said, I have students who have great careers. I have students who come into my program and haven't really done anything in the world of digital media. So they're brand new. So figuring out what they can do, what is the future world of work going to look like for them, but also what are employers looking for and how do they find that right fit with who they are and a company that's going to match their skill set, their emotional balance, well-being, right? Their extenuating circumstances is something that I think a lot of people don't think about when they're looking at, they just want to get that first job, right? They just want to get their foot in the door.
That's exactly it. And when I'm talking to my students, I don't know if you can relate to this. A lot of them are coming to grad school. Our program, specifically the school of education, is 1 year. And the reality, that's 9 months. And so when I have students in the class, what you said is, students are very focused on what employers are looking for. I like to talk when I'm talking about my students and how they're thinking about work, is really to think about what employers really need in this moment. And in some ways, our students are going to be best positioned to do this. They're digital natives. They have a comfortability with, generative AI and technology, not like some of their, elder peers may have. And so this becomes an advantage. And so one thing I've been thinking about what employers need, and I saw this with the research of the book that I have coming out, The Win-Win Workplace, is that what was clear to us is that we need more employees who have an ownership mindset, more employees who have an orientation around solving problems and thinking about how they do that from their role and seat wherever they sit within the organization. And it's leading to this place where every worker will need to be a knowledge worker in some way, our research is telling us, because every worker will need to understand how they're adding value, alongside technology like generative AI. How does it help them be more productive? How are they saving the company money? How are they solving new challenges? And that type of talent, and people are graduating with those skills, they're going to be best positioned to find the right roles, because even companies don't think they need it. When it's brought up, they say absolutely what they're looking for. So there are more companies that are forward thinking in this. There's others that are not far along on their journey, but each of them, when they have people in front of them that can articulate the value that they're able to create, those are what they're hiring for.
Yeah, I love that you said this. And because I have spoken to other professors who say, my student got this job, they're sitting at their desk, they have their first assignment at work, right? And they're calling me, their former professor, to ask what their first step is. What do they do? And so it begs the question, are we really preparing students for the world of work? And how do we do better as educators? So I'd love to hear some of the insights that you found, if you can relate to that at all.
Absolutely, I do. Every day. We have unprecedented technology at our fingertips. And the reason why this problem solving orientation is so important, we've always asked students, I don't know about you, when I was growing up, it was, what do you want to be when you grow up? I've taken with my daughter and with students, I'm like, what problems do you want to solve? What are you curious about? And really thinking not from a career, like what's going to get you really invested and what lights you up, because what lights you up is what you're going to spend time and will be motivated to learn and become expert at. So one thing we're finding is like really starting with this problem solving orientation. One, from like that individual self-interest, like what's going to motivate you. But two, when you're a problem solver, you automatically have an orientation to add value. So that example you gave a student, they get their first job, they're like, what do I do? So thinking about like, what do you do? What are the tools in front of you besides calling a professor that you can look at? You can look at Google, you can look at generative AI, you can look at a colleague. So really, training students to, yes, have a depth of knowledge in a subject, but also to come from a problem solving orientation, because there's always going to be problems to solve. That's why they need employees, right? And so really thinking and having comfortability with that orientation.
Yeah. Wow. You have an outline, 9 evidence-based strategies that can help empower workers to become exactly what you're saying, decision makers, people who feel like they have an ownership stake, kind of the entrepreneurs within a business, correct?
That's exactly it. When we did our research, the first set of research we looked at were 1,200 businesses in the book, and they were small, medium, and large. And this was during the pandemic where many people lost their jobs overnight and had to find new jobs and transition to new sectors. And what we found is like once people found new jobs, we interviewed them 6 months later to say, okay, how are you doing? And there were a set of people who were thriving in their new roles, talked about how they were being developed, how they were growing into these new challenges. And then when we looked at another set of companies where people were placed, it was basically some of those people who were placed 6 months later, they weren't there. Or 6 months later, they're like, this is not a good fit. I'm looking for a job. And so we got curious about like, what was the difference? And what we're able to find were these 9 strategies that we saw in places where we call kind of this win-win workplace, that where people were thriving, there were 9 strategies that we found present. And what these 9 strategies are, and I tell people there's lots of ways you can invest in thriving employees, but these 9 in particular also showed a correlation to the financial lift on the financial side of a business. And for us, that got exciting because those that had that financial dotted line to the financial outcomes, what we're able to see with the businesses that implemented them, the strategies were more sustained because when headwinds came or sales went down, they felt like doubling down on these strategies were a way that they could increase and drive the business. So they became even more critical.
Yeah, amazing. Do you want to tease us with one or two of them?
Yeah, I'd love to start with some of them. So the first, there's bookends. So there's 9 strategies. The centered one that we say all of the employers that we looked at started with was this whole idea of centering worker voice. And so what's so fascinating about this idea, when we went out to corporations, all of them where people were thriving and the ones where people weren't thriving, which we call a zero-sum workplace, all of them would tell you that they center worker voice and that they listen to employees, and they could tick a list down of all the things they were doing to listen. What we saw was the differentiator with those workplaces that were thriving. They could tick down the things, how they were listening and the vehicles that they were using to listen. One thing that they did that was slightly different, well, 2 things. The first was they asked questions about what mattered most to the employees. So they asked questions, for example, what are things that we can do to make you more productive? What can we do to decrease some of the barriers? What are your biggest challenges in your job today? And the second thing they did, once they asked those questions, they had the information, they had a thoughtful analysis about what they could do as an employer, as a corporation to address those challenges. And so they were able to report back, and they did this regularly. This wasn't a once a year, we're asking you. These companies are doing this on a monthly basis, some of them on a weekly basis. And what they would do is once they listened, they would come back and think about a strategy of what they could address as a company. And also they think about what they couldn't address. And what they were able to do, they had town halls, they had one-to-one meetings, and they would regularly communicate back what they heard, communicate what strategies that they could put in place on what they could do. They'd also explain what they couldn't do or what they couldn't do right now. And when we talked to employees at those workplaces, one thing that they reported was like they felt really heard. Even though sometimes they might not agree, they felt like they had an audience, which made them want to engage more. And so for us, that centering voice and really centering what matters most to employees is the big one. And then the second one I'd say is when you're centering people's voice and they're able to give their ideas and they feel like their ideas are being acted upon, what you get is strategy number 9, which is the end, and we call it the ideal state. More workplaces where people feel like they have agency, that they have an ownership mindset, that they feel like their ideas matter and that they can make a difference. And that's what we see when I say that everyone needs to understand how they add value as their individual contributor. The part of that is, yes, you need to have an analysis, but you also need to hire a manager and you need leadership that also acknowledges that. And that's what we saw in these win-win workplaces.
Yeah, amazing. And I do have an advanced copy of your book. So I'm really excited to dive in further. I've given it a cursory glance, but that's why I'm really happy to have you on the show and explain a little bit about all of your methods, all of the research, the findings to the audience. Because beyond students who are coming into the workforce, right, who are maybe getting their master's, some of them are in a great company. They want to be more entrepreneurial in their companies. Some are looking for their first job. Perhaps they are in sports, right? Or they came straight from undergrad into graduate school. We also have this whole world of workers that likely need to be upskilled for this new workforce, the new digital workforce, thinking about the number of people who don't know how to use generative AI tools today still, right? And that seems like that's going to be a minimum requirement for so many different jobs. It automates processes, whether it's marketing, financials, so many systems. We also have the issue of a lot of government workers are out of jobs or going to be out of jobs very soon, right? So how do we take all of the different components of potential employees? And I guess I should reverse that. How are employers going to start thinking about these different buckets of employees? And maybe I don't know what I'm trying to ask here, but it just seems like a big issue to me. And so I want to leave it in your hands because I just don't know what the solutions are going to be. I'm worried about all of these different factions and who's going to be hireable and who's not, and who's going to feel left out of the workforce.
Yeah. And you should be right. Like, I feel the same anxiousness that you do. And I think what I got excited about and what made me hopeful, like in doing this research and coming out with the Win-Win Workplace book, is that there are a lot of corporations who are actually leading in this front. So there was just a set of research that came out of Harvard Business School that 70% of employees report rarely using generative AI on their jobs. And when you talk to talent and you ask them why, one is like they've not been trained to do it. Two is there's certain companies, and we call these more zero-sum workplaces, who are thinking about, we need to keep this closed. We need to monitor what someone's doing on generative AI. We need to figure it out first before we train people on it. By contrast, I was just on a call with a chief people officer and head of talent from BBDO, a company that's in Canada. And one thing that they shared was they've opened up generative AI to their thousands of employees. We're talking about 26,000. They want them to come up with ideas on how they can use generative AI to actually drive their job. They're setting up training so they can actually teach people on how to use generative AI. One thing I'd love for your listeners to consider, a lot of us are thinking about that we have this fear of becoming obsolete, right? And sometimes that fear, for an employee can even stop them from experimenting. How do we lower the bar by making it discussable, by providing trainings on it, but also giving people the license and invitation to try new things? And so when we looked at that win-win workplace, these businesses were, one, putting up the training, showing people how to use it. Two, they were incentivizing them to use it. And it's so funny. They're like, we're giving away trips. We want to acknowledge and award employees who are thinking differently. And what they said was, it's sort of humble. They're saying the future of our company depends on this type of adoption and forward thinking and entrepreneurial thinking. And when we think about what's happening in the government, you mentioned this, I have a colleague, a dear friend of mine who I went to college with. She's a veteran. She worked for the IRS for 15 years. She was a tax attorney, and she was let go. She was part of 1,000 other workers who were just recently let go. And I talked to her last week. And so I said to her, how are you thinking about this? She was like, well, the market's going to be flooded for attorneys. I'm looking for jobs. We got 1,000 other people with jobs. And I said, well, how are you thinking about going about this? And she goes, I really believe that I'm going to have to just leverage my network. I'm going to have to tell everybody I'm looking for this job, and it's going to come through social networks. So my advice right now is, one is know the value you can add with these emerging technologies, because that's going to have you best positioned in a tight labor market when lots of people are committing. But two, know that you're not alone. One thing that Jennifer, my friend, did is, the reason why I found out about this, she posted it on Facebook. She had 400 people who responded. She asked for help and said what she's looking for. And you had people weighing in. I called her and said, look, I know 2 law firms. I'm going to reach out to them. So just know that you're not alone. All of us who have not been impacted, we know people who have. We also have children who are looking for jobs. So I think this is the time to really lean on your network.
Wow. That is fantastic advice. And I think that's one of the things that when somebody does go to graduate school, that is part of the biggest benefit that they get is the network, the community, yes, the alumni association, even the professors being able to introduce them to people that we know.
Absolutely. And when you go to grad schools, we're at these amazing, institutions, USC, you think Harvard, but any institution. My undergrad was the University of Missouri. What I found through alumni is that they want to be helpful. And so LinkedIn is our friends. I encourage our students to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Reach out to people, let them know that you want to learn from them. The time to make friends, right, is when you don't need them. So as you're entering into your graduate program, find alums that are doing the work, reach out to them and ask for informational interviews. Even if you're out in the world, you can still reach out to people. I do it all of the time. And I've got a rate on, this is unscientific, but I say 9 times out of 10, people are responding and they want to be helpful. So in times where there's a lot of anxiety, just know that I keep clicking on this. We're not alone in this. This is time to lean on our community, to ask for help, to be vulnerable, and to allow people to show up for you in unexpected ways.
Yeah. And that is something that I really picked up, that being vulnerable piece, because people sometimes are afraid to do that. but we have to reach out to our communities. But further, I also heard you say that while skills are fantastic and having generative AI and other digital skills is great, companies that are really looking out for their employees and creating that win-win workplace are also willing to help you learn. So if you come in with other skill sets that they find really valuable, you're not going to immediately get lost, and you're not immediately going to not understand what's happening, because they're going to help give you the tools, provide the training. And that makes me really think anecdotally of some colleagues I know I'm studying AI and ML at Villanova right now. And people in my classes who are saying, I just want us to be able to have ChatGPT licenses for my team.
Yes.
And my company, the heads of innovation, the people who are supposed to be helping propel technologies, are saying no to the training. So those I would think would fall in the zero-sum category.
That's exactly it. And it's this like analogy that you're trying to hold so tight to your trade secrets that you're not allowing your people to grow. And what I got so excited about when I looked at these like win-win workplaces, they were really thinking differently about learning. And I love your analogy of like the work that you're doing at Villanova. What the future of work will take is to become a lifelong learner. And so these win-win companies are understanding that there is a role for the employer to play in that. And so we saw companies that were implementing different kind of on-the-job learning experiences, one that was around apprenticeship-based degrees. So for example, there's a company, Craft Education, that will allow someone, as they're working with employers, if you're working in the marketing department or if you want to be a teacher, do you actually get degree and credits based on the work that you're doing today? So that allows people the flexibility to earn and learn at the same time. Some of them are creating their own institutions and saying, okay, what does it mean to be a manager? Let's train hiring managers. And which is like one of the pillars in the book when we talk about moving from a frontline manager to a frontline leader. How do we train people to be actual managers at insert company name? JP Morgan Chase did a big piece around that, and they saw engagement increase. They saw employee retention increase. They saw the assets under management increase. So again, very exciting work, but like they're not saying, you learning, you need to be a lifelong learner and it's just up to you to figure it out. They're saying with that win-win, it's in our best interest if you become a lifelong learner, and we're going to work shoulder to shoulder with you to help you do that.
Yeah. You've given us some really amazing examples. And I love to hear that these large companies are really forward thinking, because it's a lot easier to retain somebody than it is to have to go through a process to hire somebody new.
I agree. And some people think, okay, of course, large, organizations can do this, but I think these are even more relevant for small businesses. What we're seeing now is labor costs go up and hourly wages go up. How does a small or medium-sized business stay competitive against an Intel or an Amazon, especially if you could go to a fast casual restaurant and you can earn $20 or $25? One thing that I've seen with the small businesses is that they're using it as their value proposition to attract talent. So they're going out and saying, okay, you could go make all of this money from, Amazon, but like, are you going to meet Jeff Bezos or Andy Jassy? If you work for small or medium-sized businesses, the odds are that you're going to actually meet the CEO, that they will know your name, that you can learn from them, that you'll be able to try different roles. And so I'm using this research to also encourage and hopefully inspire small and medium-sized businesses to double down on this. And I'll give you an example. There's a manufacturing company in Cleveland, Ohio that I feature in the book and wrote a case study about. They're independently owned, over 100 years old. The CEO's third generation leading it, and they're manufacturing. They had a hard time filling their manufacturing job. They had a hard time attracting younger talent because, they felt like maybe their jobs weren't sexy. And so what the CEO, Jack Shern, decided to do was like, we need to look at talent differently. We need to grow your own talent strategy. They started with high schools with apprenticeships and creating them so they could start coming in and seeing the different jobs that they have available. Some of those apprentices who started 5 years ago are now in management at Jergens. And they've been able to retain them. They had lower turnover. And it's a high satisfaction because they built this culture where they're centering the voice. They're creating the strategies to actually engage people. And people are staying. And I mean, when you think about it, and your listeners will probably think this too, it's like the Post-it note. It's so simple when you think about it. And of course, it makes sense. But it all comes down to that execution and willingness to do it.
Yeah. You're giving me so much hope for the future and the way that we can shape amazing workplaces.
Yeah, I think we have to remain hope. That's in this moment. I get up and I tell people why I'm so passionate about this. And I could talk about it every day is despite the headlines, my message is there are a lot of companies that are doing this investment. And when you're an A talent, when you know how you add value, A talent will always have optionality. So really drill down and be expert. Come in with that mindset of like being, a lifelong learner and thinking how you add value. Once you do that, you will be seen as a talent. And there's companies out there that are investing and you get to vote with your feet. Look for these companies. One, to see if they're advertising and saying that they're doing this. The second is if someone isn't, use this as part of your negotiation as you're negotiating for your first job or your second job, and use the research because a lot of times we go in and we say, I want to go and train and do this advanced training. Think about how you're adding value through that training by them investing in that training, what you'll be able to do for them. And so I think the data really matters when you're making those cases.
Yeah. And you also pointed something out that I think is really key. There are many positions that start with apprenticeships that can be really high earning positions where you don't necessarily need to go to a 2-year or 4-year or institution or graduate school. We are proponents of higher education, but that's not for everybody. And there are a lot of, certificate programs you can go through to upskill if you are in the workforce and you're going, gosh, I think I need to learn a little bit more. Maybe you're working at a zero-sum company. You might want to make a transition. There are a lot of resources out there on the internet to have opportunities to upskill and be able to take these certifications to the next place that might be a little more open and engaging.
That's exactly right. And I feel like the world is very, in terms of education, is very dynamic. And a lot of times you say either you go to college or you don't, you go to trade school. I don't think it's that anymore, right? It can be both things can be true and it can be more of a both and. What we're hearing from people who might have caregiving and family responsibilities, they're not able to go away to college to a residential program because it doesn't fit into their life. That doesn't mean that they don't want to learn. Even at Harvard, one thing we're doing is more online courses, and there's an acknowledgement of that. We launched a couple years ago our first online masters, and we got older adults, people who have those family responsibilities who had wanted to come to the institution, but we didn't have anything in place to better serve them, right? And now that when we did, people showed up. And so I don't think it's an either or. I think during your life of lifelong learning, sometimes you will go to a trade school. You might do a Coursera course. You might go back to an executive leadership program, but it all has to be those options that fit into your life and that time.
Yeah. Now let's talk about psychological safety as part of the workforce, because that is also, of course, something that we're all thinking about right now. We see a lot of companies standing firm in their values and beliefs, other companies rolling back what they'd espoused as their belief systems. And this is creating, for us as consumers as well, a lot of angst around which companies on which list, who do we support, who do we not support. I always think about then how is that going to hurt or harm the employees of those organizations too? Because yes, we may, want to do something to kneecap shareholders and the board and a large corporation, but I want to make sure those employees are taken care of. So, that's one issue. But then the other is, how do companies show up and not feel scared to show up for who they really are and to be able to stand firm in saying, if you come here, here are our values. We are not going to put them on the back burner. We're going to shout them out, and we are going to create safety for our employees who may be a member of this community or that community.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought this up because I, like everyone else and many of your listeners, we've been glued to these headlines. And really what we're seeing is a crisis of trust. And this is bigger than diversity, equity, and inclusion. I always tell people, I'm not going to die on the sword of an acronym. When we think about the whole rationale and the origin of DEI as it relates to the workplace, really the sense and the spirit behind it was, how can we ensure that people show up and can bring their full selves to work and be productive? That's good for the person. It's good for the company. And that's been politicized in many ways. But if we go back to the origin of that, that's still really important. And I think you find bipartisan support for that. And so what we really need to think about and what we write in these pillars are, we know what that looks like. And we can make an argument that it's not just good for the employee, it's actually good for the business. So I think in these times, it's really important to have that analysis. So what we saw were a lot of companies, they were virtue signaling. It was very performative. Some of the programs they put in, they didn't measure. So when they're called to the carpet, they couldn't say if it really drove the business or not. They couldn't say if it was good or not. And so what we're saying in this book is put the, center employee voice, create programs, but then measure them. If they're not working, then we need to tweak them, right? Like, I don't think anyone wants to be involved with a program that's not working. And so really having an analysis about how these programs are driving employee thriving and how they're driving the business, like having that analytic is so important. And I just say my big takeaway is the world is watching. You saw Jamie Dimon a couple of weeks ago. He held a town hall. Town hall is for, ideally employee listening. Someone stood up and asked a question that he didn't like. And he was like, I don't care. If you don't come back to work, then you can leave. And some of those DEI programs, they didn't work. And he had a defensive posture, which he came back for and apologized for. But what I want to say is, even though he apologized, you can't take that away when we talk about psychological safety. And that's what happens in a lot of zero-sum workplaces. We ask employees for their opinion. We give out surveys. We have town halls. We have Ask Me Anything. And then as soon as they get a question they don't like, instead of being vulnerable or leaning into it, they go on the attack. And what happens? That shuts people down. They don't want to be like the guy who stood up and got yelled at and then subsequently was fired by his direct line manager, even though JP Morgan Chase said, he wasn't fired, but he was. And not that manager was told to fire him. That's what he thought should happen. And that's what happens in a zero-sum workplace when you question the CEO. You just get fired. And not even question. He didn't question. He asked a question, right? And so I just think we need to be clear on what this feels like for employees, that psychological safety, when it's absent, productivity goes down, people are looking for jobs, people are scared, innovation goes down, and this is all research back. So it's really clear in this moment of wars, all of the headwinds we have gone, all of the economic issues, that employers are very clear on who they are, that they have some data and analysis behind where they are. When we think about Costco, they were like, look, this is driving our business. We're doubling down. We have the data to show for it. So they have something to stand up to. Also, if they're challenged legally, we live in a capitalistic society. So if you actually have data and shows how it drives your business,
Yes.
no one can fault you for that. That's very different than saying, we do this because it feels nice.
Right.
And so I think having that data argument is just so important.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And that's something that I talk about a lot when it comes to digital marketing, digital media management, which is a separate issue. But what you're saying is this plays out in everything that we do. Can't have the storytelling element just because it feels good, like you said, or because it creates a great story and people resonate with it. You have to have data and analytics to back up every single decision that you make. You have to be able to show an ROI.
You have to, because then you become someone like Target. And I think, they're the nice one to pick on today. But, one thing they did around George Floyd, the, racial awareness of working, they doubled down, they invested in, folks of color, in different gender identities. And they did so well and they were beloved. And we saw that a lot of their customers were voting with their dollars and shopping with them because it aligned with their values. And what happens when you switch automatically, you lose trust. You become and risk being fickle, right? Because you haven't done your data and because you deeply don't see the economic case, you're able to shift that way. Because if they had the data, they would have thought about it differently. And what they're seeing now is that the customer base that chose them because of that, the people who chose to work with them, they're leaving. And customers have a long memory, and your prospective employees have a long memory too. We're not going to forget. We're not going to forget what Jamie did. We're not going to forget how Target flipped. And we're going to do other things with our dollars. And so it does become a brand issue with your stakeholders, and it does impact business. And we're seeing that in the market right now with both of those brands.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm thinking about so many other examples of things where we saw perhaps somebody in an ad for a beer product or for this product or that product. And we saw reactions and we saw numbers of sales go down. So that was a very visceral reaction that we could all, we all were privy to that information. It wasn't being hidden. Yeah.
But it just tells us, with companies, we have to close the gap between what we say and what we do.
Right.
We always talk about employees are our most valuable resource. Then how are you tracking that? How do you actually know that? When we talk about people analytics, and the work in my book and the Win-Win Workplace is different, we're not saying just track people to track people. We're saying to what end? We're saying, how do these investments help people? Because we know that there are ambassadors, our champions. We know that our clients, our customers care deeply about how we treat people. And we're communicating what we're doing internally and externally. And we're standing by our values because actually there's some rigor behind what we're doing, right? And we can make the case for it.
Yeah. Amazing. Your book is, as of this release of this episode, is coming out in a day or two. What is the best place for people to purchase it?
Yeah, so they can go, Amazon, wherever books are sold. We love independent bookstores. So if you go to bookshop.org, you will see the book there, and that sale will go to an independent bookshop. And the other thing that we're doing, and I'd love to invite your listeners, we're launching a campaign, and it's called the Win-Win Workplace. So if they do a hashtag, and if they email me, they can get a kit. We want people to tell their win-win workplace stories, because we feel in this moment there's a lack of imagination, and some people really just need inspiration, right? To know, what are you enjoying about your work? What is your workplace doing in this moment that's having a marked difference in your life and your ability to show up and be yourself? So let's share those stories. Let's hashtag companies who we know are doing a really good job so that they get more awareness. Bad news travels so fast. What we're hoping to do is spread some good news.
Yeah, I really love that. And I will definitely participate and encourage other people to participate, because we do need that good news. We need to hear the success stories, the happy stories, the stories of places where people really love to go to work, where they're going to show up with their whole selves, where they're going to be able to learn and grow within the company. Is there one last piece of advice that you would give to a company of any size when they're thinking about how to make sure that they are one of those great companies to work for, that they are really putting value into their employees, and that they're showing up? It's not just lip service.
Yeah, the biggest thing that they can do, and that goes back to pillar one, is to really be in tune with your employees. We saw during the pandemic, I'm Gen X. I was raised professionally. What happens at home, you keep it at home. And, even though it's something personal is going home, you're thinking about it at work, even if it's not being discussed. So to really be in tune with your employees, to understand that, this is a new workplace. And so some of those old norms, what we call in the book, the zero-sum workplace, then it's not relevant. It's relevant today. There's a new generation of talent who are fast becoming the majority talent. They have different expectations, and we know what to do. We know what good management feels like. So really, my big advice is to listen to them, to respect them, to let them know that you've heard through your actions, not performative, through your actions.
Amazing. And of course, Dr. Angela, we're going to link your website, drangelajackson.com, in the show notes so people can get in touch with you, read more about everything that you're pouring into the world. I could ask you questions for probably hours because this is so fascinating, but I'm definitely going to encourage everybody to go to your website to get your book. I always do ask one last question, which is, what continues to inspire you every day? Is there a word, a phrase, a verse, a poem, a family motto, anything that keeps you doing what you do?
Yeah, no, I love that. There is this, and I wrote this in my book, and it's so amazing. There's this teacher, his name was Howard Thurman, and he wrote these words, which at the end of the book, I wrote it in, and I think it's so important. It says, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. And that inspires me. And I have a problem-solving orientation, and I can't think of anything more critical in this moment. It is more critical than making sure people are okay, that people can engage. And this is top of mind. So I'm just honored to be able to do this work and have this conversation with you.
Well, I'm very honored to have you on the show. So thank you for everything you're doing. And thank you to everybody who's listening to this episode or watching it on your favorite platform. Don't forget to give us a rating review. Let me know what other content you want to hear and see from my amazing guests. And I'll be back again with another great guest sharing their stories, some tips and tricks to make your world of work and your life a little bit better every day in the next couple days. Thanks for listening or watching to this episode of Your Brand Amplified. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you want to learn more, check us out at yourbrandamplified.com.